autism, ADHD. I find a lot of these names that we give to kids nowadays. One of the things that comes up, well, when I was younger, I didn't see anyone that had a lot of this. So is it true that it didn't exist to the level it does now? Or is it just that we didn't diagnose it that way then?
There are some studies on this topic because it is a big question that people have. Back in the 70s, the rates were about 1 in 10,000. So if you had, a special needs classroom, you might have a person with autism, but that's not how it is today. That's kind of the first bit of argument on the subject. Where are all the adults in their 40s and 50s with autism right now, if it was as prevalent as it was? But there's actually real science showing that they looked at this and they said that cannot be found to be diagnostics alone. They said even a more moderately conservative study found that maybe about 50% or so, maybe we could attribute to that, but there's something else going on where, 50, 60% is something else. There's no genetic epidemics. So there's something going on.
You mentioned you've now been in this 20 years. What's your answer to what is going on?
I think it's a combination of genetic predisposition and environmental assaults. There are a lot more environmental assaults we've had in the last 50 years with all the chemicals. If you have poorer detoxification, you're more likely to be injured by those. And if there's more toxins, that's going to be a factor. But also toxins can actually affect your epigenetics or how our genes express the ability to detoxify. And so sometimes toxins can also affect our genes. Just that one thing alone can have really a cyclical effect. And so I think that is one of the main things that's going on.
When you talk about toxins, you're talking about in the air, so environmental, you're talking about in our food. What does it all encompass,
All of them, do we use more pesticides in our home? Do we use more on our food? We have things like glyphosate now that disrupt the microbiome. We know the microbiome is a big area of difference and challenge and concern in people with autism. Antibiotics, again, they're wonderful things. We need them for life-saving, but they do affect our microbiome. I actually went off a little bit. I went into the microbiome conversation. We just stick with the toxin topic. Yes, toxins in our food additives, chemicals in our environment, all of these types of things can affect the brain. Some of them are neurotoxins. They kill bugs by damaging the nervous system. So some of them affect the brain directly. Some of them affect the mitochondria. Some of them affect all sorts of different systems. And then that can affect the brain.
Obviously, parents are getting more and more attuned to it. It's like, okay, we need to rethink the choices we're making in our lifestyles and in the food we put in our bodies. But I think people are also getting very stymied by all the different influencers, all the different voices that are saying, well, do this or do that. And everyone kind of is pointing in slightly different directions, sometimes grand directions, like completely opposite from each other. You've worked with thousands of families. I mean, can you share one transformation story that has given you goosebumps in terms of what changed and how it showed up?
One of my favorite stories is the story that if people have my book in the introduction and then the conclusion is the individual I'm talking about. He was a client of mine when he was about 5. He's now 21. He had pretty significant autism, tantrums, some challenges with language, challenges sleeping. It was challenging for him, in school and all of that. His mom worked on diet as well as nutrition for many years, step by step, changing different things, a gluten-free diet, casein-free diet, evolving into different diets and doing testing and doing supplements and things. And today he is graduated from high school. He's an Eagle Scout. He's in college. He wants to be a writer. He won an award for writing at his college last year. He is really doing amazingly well. And in the conclusion, he talks in his own words about how important diet has been for him. I think that's just one, because it's nice to hear from the person themselves and their journey and what it felt like and how important the diet piece was. So that's probably one of my favorite stories.
Well, so many cultures, they relied on a lot of the foods I've talked about in previous episodes, these traditional ancestral foods like organ meats and fermented vegetables, because that's ultimately, I think, what people want to know is like, okay, so what foods did support him? What ancestral foods are you finding are the most most supportive for these kids with autism and ADHD?
Starting even with just a whole foods diet. Artificial additives, colors, flavors, we know in the research that they create significant hyperactivity and behavioral challenges. That's just one. Start with whole foods and you're all going to be avoiding entire categories of MSG. We know glutamate causes problems in the brain. It's excitatory. That alone is a good start. I really do like things like liver. So in my book, one of the recipes is burgers with liver, getting a little bit in a way that's tasty and enjoyable. You know, it's fairly hidden, but it really enhances the flavor of the burger. It's actually quite good. Liver is one of my favorites for ancestral foods. Getting good quality grass-fed, getting close to that wild caught fish, grass-fed meat, those kinds of things. And then usually most people I work with don't do wheat, gluten, or dairy. So more of that, staying away from those farmed grains, but particularly things like wheat, dairy.
If you were working with a parent these days, starting to work with somebody, is there just 1 to 3 foods that you're just like, look, if you want to work with me, you have to be willing to cut these out? Because I know you're very into bio-individuality, but is there kind of like, here are the foods I believe everyone should not be eating?
Ooh, that's a good one. I mean, I think a big one are things like sugar. Honestly, that's a little bit of maybe even more difficult than something like gluten, because gluten, we can just take it out. With sugar, I mean, I want them to reduce sugar as much as possible. But the things that absolutely zero of, it depends how I answer the question. If I answer it from one side, it's no artificial colors, flavors, preservatives, all of those additives. Ideally, be no refined foods, no refined sugar, no refined flour, things like that. However, on the other side, I'd say no gluten, no dairy. For most
At least
of
kind
us,
of at first, right? Let's eliminate these things at first and see how they're moving the needle or not moving the needle for your child.
Exactly. That's why it's a little hard for me to answer the question. I have a 12-step approach, and the first one is remove the artificial stuff. But then second is add the good stuff. And then we don't get to avoid gluten and casein until we get to step 5. But I do think it's one of the most often valuable dietary trials. That's why I guess it took me a little while to kind of answer that question. It does depend on the person. However, I do find that those are some of the things that are either generally not good for our health as humans in general, or particularly problematic for people with autism.
If you enjoyed the clip from the podcast, make sure to check out the next video up here, or head over to watch the full episode down here. And before you go, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Come on. Yeah, thanks for watching.